All right, so in this video, we're going to continue looking at the exploration process. So we're going to finish up talking a little bit more about the Spanish and the Portuguese, but now we're going to start to draw in a few other European powers, especially those in Western Europe, which had more of a maritime heritage. So we're going to think about the English and the French and the Dutch, and we're going to pull them into the story as well. So we ended the last video with the Treaty of Tordesillas and the budding rivalry between Spain and Portugal. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of expand on that colonial system that both of these countries produced in the Western Hemisphere. So most of what we're going to be talking about is pretty much just talking about Spain. If it comes up, most of this is also going to apply to the Portuguese too, but they're pretty much isolated to just Brazil. So let's talk for a little bit about what the Spanish do once they have kind of gotten their foothold in the Western Hemisphere. So in the 1520s into the 1530s, the Spanish conquer first the Aztec in Mexico, and then later the Inca in South America. Most of this was accomplished due to disease. So specifically things like smallpox and measles, but also to a smaller degree the use of gunpowder. So they had gunpowder weapons, but most of the conquering happened because of disease. And the people in the Western Hemisphere just were not in any way ready for the diseases brought from Europe, like smallpox or measles. And it really just destroyed Native American populations. I've seen estimates of up to 90% of the population was either infected or died as a result of disease, and that pretty much just let the Spanish walk in and take over most of North and South America. As a result, the Spanish, and remember the Portuguese are doing this too, but just to a lesser extent. The Spanish begin exporting all sorts of luxury goods back to Spain. So things like exotic hardwoods, cocoa, like raw cocoa, so cacao, other spices, but maybe the most important thing that they're going to bring back to Spain is silver. The Spanish find 2 mountains worth of silver in one in Mexico and one in Peru. And this silver is going to turn the Spanish into a superpower. The Spanish are now a superpower thanks to silver. Unbeknownst to the Spanish, though, this is also going to be their undoing, and we'll talk more about that in our next small topic, which will be about the commercial revolution. But all of this silver that the Spanish are bringing to Europe is going to eventually bankrupt them. So it's going to lead to a bunch of inflation that's going to cause their economy to collapse, but we won't worry about that just yet. For the time being, Spain is now a superpower. They have now become super rich. I don't want to dwell a lot on the colonial system, mostly because I think this is kind of a gray area in terms of how AP Euro kind of views this, because this is still technically European, but it's outside the scope of Europe. So it's kind of a gray area. So we'll talk a little bit about this, with the idea being that even if it shows up on the exam, it won't be a big part of the exam. So the colonial system here is, so we'll kind of talk about the political system first. The Spanish set up a system in which there were two viceroys. And think of a viceroy as like a vice king. So they are the highest possible authority outside of the king himself. So there were two of them. There was one in Mexico, and there was one in South America. So basically, there was a viceroy in Mexico who covered North America, and there was a viceroy in Peru that covered South America. These guys technically reported to the king, but because of distance, they were essentially independent. It took so long for orders to cross the Atlantic that the viceroys were basically allowed to do whatever they wanted because it took so long to get orders. And if they didn't get orders that they liked, the viceroys could just ask for further instructions, or if they simply didn't want to follow the orders, they would just not follow the orders, and there was very little the king could actually do about it. So for all intents and purposes, these were independent places that sent money and stuff back to Spain. And as long as the money and the luxury goods kept flowing, we can forgive a bunch of other stuff as long as you keep sending us money. Now, if we think about the social system, the social system is going to sound a lot like the caste system in India. So if you're familiar with what the caste system looks like in India, it looks like that, except it's much more complex. So there are 16 classes of people, and they are ranked by how European they are and how pure they are. So if you have a little bit of European blood in you, that means that you are higher ranked than someone who has no European blood. And if you are a pure-blooded Native American person, you would be higher ranked than someone who is Native American and maybe African. So basically, the way this worked was that Europeans and people who pass as Europeans are at the top, and of course people who have darker skin, so Native Americans and Africans, are farther down the system. The reason why there were so many classes of people is that about 80% of Spanish colonists were men, which meant that they married Native women or sometimes African women. And I put married in quotation marks because some of these marriages were not consented to. Some of these marriages were not agreed to. So usually a marriage happened to legitimize children, or the women just didn't want to get married and they were forced into it. But that's essentially what happened. It's unpleasant, but it's a fact of history. Okay, so one more thing we'll say about the social system and how it kind of relates to the economics is that the Spanish used a lot of coerced labor in their colonies. The Spanish used a lot of coerced labor. Now, the most obvious form of coerced labor is slavery. So there were a lot of African slaves, and these people were often used on plantations, usually making sugar. But there are other types of coerced labor that the Spanish used, like the encomienda system and the mita system. Encomienda is a way to kind of force people to do agricultural work. So encomienda kind of it looks okay because what the Spanish are essentially doing is in return for doing the agricultural work, the Spanish will take care of the Native Americans. So they'll feed them and clothe them and educate them, teach them how to read, teach them how to be Christian. Usually this part was kind of forgotten about. And they really only wanted people to do the agricultural work. Mita was a way of coercing labor that was mostly used for silver mining. And what ended up happening was that the silver mining is really dangerous work in dangerous places. So this is way up in the mountains. And the Spanish forced the Native Americans to do this because they were used to living in the mountains, so they were used to the altitude up there, and African slaves typically weren't. Mining is also a skilled job. You have to be trained to do the mining, and the Native Americans were already trained in how to do it. So they forced the Native Americans to mine the silver to take back to Spain. This was a process that the Inca used previous to the Spanish showing up. So the Spanish just adopted this practice. And it's actually not that different from a medieval practice that we would see in Europe called corvée, which is basically a system of taxing people, but instead of them giving you money, you extract labor from them. So there's a similarity here between something that the Spanish would probably be familiar with, and they just adopted this idea that the Inca were already doing. So it's kind of it's something that we would have seen in both places. In Europe, we would call it corvée. In South America, we would call it mita. It's basically a system of taxation through labor. It's basically taxation through labor. Again, I'm not sure how much of this stuff is going to show up on the exam. I've looked at the course description. This is kind of a gray area, so I don't want to leave you without talking about it, but I also don't know how much of this stuff is actually going to be on the exam. So we'll just leave it there. I don't think you'll need to know anything beyond this for the exam. This is more than what I think they're expecting you to know. But it is nice to kind of put all of this stuff into context. Okay, so we're going to move on from the Spanish and bring in some other players. So let's talk about the English next. So the English are going to get involved later. So they start to get involved in the early 17th century. They are going to be busy with lots of internal problems. And that's why they get a late start. So once they understand what the Spanish have figured out, they get involved, but they're not really all that involved to start with. Essentially, they're letting the Spanish and the Portuguese kind of do the heavy lifting before they get involved. So they're busy with a lot of internal issues. We'll talk about those internal issues as we go, but they don't get started in any of this until maybe the very beginning of the 17th century, and then not in any real numbers until the mid 17th century. Once they do, however, they start setting up large government-backed agricultural colonies. And these are all along the east coast of North America. And these are what Americans might remember as the 13 colonies. So these were all kind of government-backed agricultural colonies. A lot of these were very poorly planned out. Colonies. There are stories where colonists would show up with crates and crates of clothes, but very little in the way of farming supplies or tools. So they really relied on the Native Americans to survive. There were very few people coming over that actually knew how to do any of this stuff. In fact, a lot of the earliest colonists were religious, and I hesitate to call them refugees because that implies that something bad was happening to them. A lot of these guys are the quote unquote Puritans, and they left England and eventually they moved to the Netherlands, and they were kicked out of there because they weren't allowed to be intolerant. So a lot of these people came to North America to be as religiously intolerant as they'd like. So I hesitate to call them refugees, even though that's, I guess, technically what they are. But they wanted a chance to be as religiously intolerant as they'd like. Now, also remember that a lot of these people were also the Anibaptists. And the Anabaptists were more willing to do the work that was necessary, and they survived pretty well. But a lot of these people weren't ready for what it would take to survive in this place. So they set up a lot of agricultural. So these were agricultural colonies. But the difference here between, or another difference between what they're doing here and what the Spanish would do, is that these were more family based. So you see more of a mix. It's kind of more evenly mixed between men and women. So you're going to see more women come over, which means that there's going to be less mixing between races. And one of the consequences of that is that the English are going to be much more racist. The Spanish are racist, but they're more tolerant of other people. Like, they live with them, they have families with them. It's more of a subtle racism. Here, it's a virulent, kind of overt racism that Native Americans and Africans are just completely beneath white people, and it's very apparent. The Spanish, it's more subtle, it's more institutionalized, but they're more tolerant. Generally speaking, the English are also going to use coerced labor, but this is more of a Southern and Caribbean thing. This isn't to say that there aren't slaves in the northern part, but the northern colonies are less agricultural. The northern colonies are less agricultural, and they're more based on manufacturing and trade, which means you need less coerced labor. Also, up here, you're going to have more religious opposition to slavery. So again, people like the Anabaptists would be opposed to slavery because it means that someone else is doing your work, and you need to do work because that's good for you. So you're going to see less coerced labor in the northern English colonies. It doesn't mean that they're less racist. It just means that you're going to see less coerced labor. In these southern and Caribbean colonies, you're going to see a lot of tobacco farming and a lot of sugar. Briefly, we can talk about the French. The French are not going to be as big a player in North America. The French are going to be seen in two places. They're going to be seen in kind of northern, central North America. So think like where modern Canada is. And these people are going to be, it's pretty sparsely populated. And most of these people are doing like fur trapping. And for the most part, these people get along pretty well with the Native Americans. They get along pretty well with the Native Americans because they're pretty much living the same lifestyle as the Native Americans. They trap the animals. They use all the parts of the animal. They live a similar kind of hunting and gathering lifestyle. And they mostly just kind of coexist with the Native Americans. We're also going to see the French in the Caribbean. And they are going to set up a bunch of sugar colonies, sugar plantations. And these are going to be just as bad as the other European colonies. So these are just the same as other European sugar colonies. They're just as bad, but they're also just as lucrative. And we'll come back to these guys during the French Revolution, because the most profitable French sugar plantation on the island of Hispaniola, the French called it Saint-Domingue, they're going to have a revolution the same way that they have a revolution in France. And they are going to declare their independence. And we'll talk all about the Haitian Revolution when we get to it. But just note that they are doing the same kind of stuff that we see the English doing and the Spanish doing, and to a lesser extent the Portuguese. All of these people are using coerced labor to produce sugar and other cash crops. Now, there's one more group that I want to talk about, and they're not in North America, so we'll kind of separate them off to the side here, and that's the Dutch. The Dutch are going to be involved mostly in Southeast Asia, specifically Indonesia. They try to have a foothold in North America. They try to have a foothold there, but eventually the English take it over. So they had the city of New Amsterdam, but eventually it turns into New York. But basically the Dutch are going to be doing the same thing in Indonesia that the French and the English and the Spanish are doing in North America. They're going to use coerced labor to harvest spices to send back to the Netherlands. Now, there's not going to be African slavery. These guys are going to be they use native labor to harvest the spices. So instead of Native Americans, they'll use native Indonesians. But the Dutch are doing their thing on the other side of the world, still as unethical, still as immoral. They're just doing it over there, whereas all the other Europeans are mostly focused on North America. So for right now, we're going to hit pause. We've got one more video about exploration that we've got to cover, and these are kind of the big picture effects of the exploration process. So we've got to talk about the Columbian exchange, and we've got to talk about the slave trade. So kind of big picture exploration stuff, but we'll do that in our next video. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.